Okay, from the reference guide to regulatory compliance within subsection 3 about deposits, I'm reading on page 441 from regulation J. I left off in payment of items by the Federal Reserve. And the last part to get out about payment was that if a reserve bank is closed on a day that paying bank receives a cash item, the paying bank will settle for the item on the next day that is a banking day for the reserve bank and pay its administrative reserve bank by 9:30 a.m. on the next banking day. The form of settlement under the payment section shall be made by a debit to the paying bank's account at the reserve bank or cash or any other form as the reserve bank may provide in its operating circulars or notice in lieu of a return. If a cash item is unavailable for return, the paying bank may give a notice in lieu of the return under Reg CC. Non-cash items. Part 4 under payment by the reserve bank. The reserve bank may require payment in cash or may permit the debit to an account of the books of the reserve bank or at the option of the reserve bank by draft, transfer of funds, or bank credit or any other payment authorized by state law. For a non-bank payer, reserve banks may require non-bank payer to pay in cash or may permit payment by cashier's check, certified check, or any other draft or obligation. Sixth, a reserve bank may handle any bank draft or other form of payment that it receives for a cash item as a cash item. Bank drafts or other forms of payment for a non-cash item may be treated either as a cash item or a non-cash item. Liability of reserve banks. A reserve bank will not be liable for the failure of a paying bank, collecting bank, or a non-bank payer to pay for an item. Moving out of the payment section into section I, time, schedule, and funds availability. Reserve banks must include time schedules in their circulars that show when items may be counted as reserves or become available for each of their offices. Reserve banks that hold the settlement account must give immediate or deferred credit according to the schedule of the receiving bank. Regardless of its schedule, a reserve bank may refuse to permit the use of credit given for cash items or return checks for a reasonable time period. A reserve bank must give credit for non-cash items at the time it receives finally collected funds. A reserve bank may use a published schedule to give credit for the non-cash items. Proceeds from non-cash items may count as reserves for Reg D purposes when the reserve bank receives payment. Under section J, return of cash items. If an item is received directly or indirectly from a reserve bank, a paying bank may return it to the reserve bank under Reg CC, the UCC, and its operating circulars. Special agreements may be made but may not extend the return times. Items not received from a reserve bank may be returned to reserve bank in accordance with Reg CC, the UCC, and the reserve bank's operating circulars. The following parties in the following order are deemed to have handled a return check to a reserve bank: a paying or returning bank, a paying or returning bank's administrative reserve bank, the reserve bank that receives the check, any other reserve bank that receives the check, and I would think then the sender would be one to note here. 4. The returning item to a reserve bank may, the paying and returning banks, when returning items to the reserve bank, the paying and return banks, A, cannot disclaim the warranties, authorizations, and agreements whether or not the return check bears an endorsement of the paying bank or returning bank. B, The paying and returning banks authorize the reserve bank to handle the item in accordance with Reg J and the operating circulars. C, paying and returning bank's warrant the check bears all endorsements applied by all parties that handle the check in paper or electronic form. D, paying and returning banks make the returning bank warrant any return item that is in electronic form and if the item were a check. E, paying and returning banks make the following warranties for electronic items that are not representations of substitute checks. This involves 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, the electronic image portion of the item accurately represents the front and back of the check as of the time it was truncated. 2, the information contains a record of all microline information. 3, the item conforms to the technical standards for an electronic item set forth in any operating circular. And 4, no person will receive a transfer, presentment, or return of an item or will otherwise be charged for the item such that the person will be asked to make payment on an item he or she has already paid. Section F, liability to reserve banks. Paying and returning banks agree to indemnify each reserve bank for any loss or expense resulting from paying or returning bank's lack of authorization or any action by a reserve bank within the scope of its authority related to the return of the check or any warranty made by the reserve bank. Limitations on liability. The liability of paying and returning bank is subject to the following conditions and limitations. A, the paying or returning bank that sends an original check that is returned as a substitute check or paper or electronic representation thereof will not be responsible for amounts the reserve bank pays under Reg CC absent the paying bank's or returning bank's agreement to the contrary. B, Regulation CC governs the paying and returning bank's liabilities when returning a substitute check or paper or electronic presentation thereof. Or C, the paying or returning bank that sends an electronic item that is not a representation of a substitute check will not be liable for losses attributable to the reserve bank's own lack of good faith or failure to exercise ordinary care. Nothing in Regulation J limits any warranty or indemnity required by the state or federal law or regulation. Warranties and liabilities of reserve banks. A reserve bank makes the following warranties when it handles a returned item. For all items, the reserve bank warrants that the returned check bear all endorsements by all parties that previously handled the checks. For all electronic items, the reserve bank warrants all of the Regulation CC warranties as though they were paper checks. And third, for electronic items that are not representations of substitute checks, the reserve bank warrants the following to the bank to which it sends the item. A, that the electronic portion of the item accurately represents all of the information on the front and back of the check as of the time the check was truncated. B, all microline information is contained on the item. C, the item conforms to the technical standards set forth in the operating circular. And D, no person will receive a transfer, presentment, or return or otherwise be charged for the item such that the person will be asked to make payment based on an item he or she has already paid. B, if the return check, and exactly what is this? B of warranties and limitations of reserve banks. If the return check is an electronic item that is not a representation of a substitute check, reserve banks will indemnify a bank to which the check is returned if the bank incurs losses as a result of indemnities the bank would be required to make under Reg CC in connection with a substitute check later created from the return check. A reserve bank will not be liable, however, if the loss could be attributed to a lack of good faith or failure to exercise ordinary care on the part of any person who handled the item. In some cases, a reserve bank can recover from the paying or returning bank if a judgment is rendered against it for actions taken by the reserve bank in handling a return check. The reserve bank may recover by charging any account on its books maintained by the sender if the reserve bank made written demand on other bank to assume defense of the proceeding and the other bank has not made any other payment arrangement acceptable to the reserve bank. The reserve bank may handle a return check or a notice of non-payment according to the requirements of Reg CC and its operating circular. A subsequent returning bank or a depository bank must settle for return checks in the same manner as for cash items presented for payment. Section K, unpaid items. Reserve banks may recover for items not paid by charging back the item to the sender, whether or not the item itself can be sent back. Second, reserve banks may not pay the items on banks that are closed. May not pay any items on banks that are closed. And L, obligations payable by governments and political subdivisions. Reserve banks may present bills, notes, or warrants issued and payable by government and political subdivisions directly to the payer and will generally apply to the payors. Time limits. Section M. Time limits may be extended to a bank or reserve bank if delays are caused by interruption of communications or computer facilities, emergency conditions, or other circumstances beyond its control. Fedwire transfer coverage. Persons covered. Reserve banks sending or receiving payment orders. Other persons covered include senders of payments to a reserve bank, banks receiving payments by means of a credit to an account at a reserve bank, and beneficiaries that receive payment by means of a credit to an account at a reserve bank, or other parties to a fund transfer, any part of which is carried through Fedwire, including government agencies, foreign government agencies, international organizations, and foreign central banks. Transactions subject to the Electronic Fund Transfers Act, Reg J, covers the Fedwire transaction even if a portion of the transaction is covered by EFTA. However, that portion of the funds transfer that is covered by the EFTA is not governed by Reg J except for remittance transfers. We have definitions of Fedwire transfers, inter-district transfers, and intra-district transfers. Fedwire transfers are the Federal Reserve System for transmitting and settling payment orders. Inter-district transfers are transfers involving entries to accounts maintained at two different reserve banks, and intra-district transfers are transfers involving entries to accounts maintained at the same reserve bank. Fedwire transfer requirements. A, the bank may rely on numbers given in a payment order to identify an intermediary and beneficiary bank. And B, reserve banks, when acting as beneficiary bank, may rely on the number in the payment order that identifies the beneficiary. Sender's agreement. A, reserve banks have the right to debit payment amounts from accounts of senders with the reserve bank. B, senders do not have the right to create overdrafts in their accounts at the reserve bank. Any overdraft is due and payable without demand at the end of the funds transfer day when the reserve bank deems itself to be insecure or at the time the sender suspends payments or is closed, whichever is earlier. C, sender must have in its account at the time of an overdraft is due and payable a balance of collected funds sufficient to cover the amount of all of its obligations to the reserve bank. D, sender gives the reserve bank a security interest in all of the sender's assets that are in the possession of the reserve bank to secure any obligations to the reserve bank, including an overdraft. E, a reserve bank has rights of a creditor to recover an overdraft, including the right to set off. And F, senders have 30 days after receiving notice of payment order to notify the reserve bank of an erroneously executed or authorized payment order. Subsection 6, receiver's agreement. A, receiving bank authorizes the reserve bank to credit the receiving bank's account. And B, an offline bank warrants to the reserve bank that it does not as an intermediary bank or a beneficiary's bank for payment orders received for a beneficiary that is a bank unless the offline bank notifies the reserve bank in writing. Subsection 7, payment orders. A, reserve banks may reject payment orders for any reason. B, senders may not send payment orders to a reserve bank unless authorized by the reserve bank. C, reserve banks are authorized to use other reserve banks in an intra-district transfer. D, senders may not require the use of a non-reserve bank as an intermediary bank unless the reserve bank agrees. E, senders may not request transmission other than by Fedwire unless the reserve bank agrees in writing. And F, senders cannot request transmissions on a day other than the day the payment order is given to the reserve bank without the agreement of the reserve bank. Lastly, there's a payment to a bank or beneficiary section and an enforcement section. Enforcement is relatively expected, but within payment to a bank or beneficiary, that's covered in 12 Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 210.3.